Hi everybody, my name is Daily Doer and I was assigned chapter 3 in our textbook. It's on the development of dominant minority group relations in pre-industrial America, and it talks about the origins of slavery. I think especially right now, this chapter was pretty important and eye-opening. It definitely showcases how far we've come, and in times like this, I think it's really important. And so if you have some spare time, read it yourself. But let's get right into the outline. Also, I want to add, I apologize for filming on my phone. I was going to film on my laptop. However, I'm not tech savvy, and also my laptop is so loud that you can barely hear my voice. So I apologize for the poor video. So on the left here is the outline that I created. I first took a few minutes to summarize the chapter, and then throughout the outline, I made bullet points, and especially during the beginning of the chapter, it has a lot of key terms, so I went ahead and highlighted those. I'm the type of student that highlights a lot. So the first part of this chapter is just the introduction. It talks about what the chapter is going to be discussing. It the type of dominant and the contact situation. So it defines the contact situation as the conditions under which groups first come together. So basically when the whites came over and took over America, and each of the three different groups in America, so such as the African Americans, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans, each of those groups have different contact situations. So that's what it's talking about. Then it jumps into the origins of slavery. So slavery was started not just by, as we know it, buying and shipping slaves. It started as indentured servants. So indentured servants were contact laborers who are obligated to serve a master for a specific number of years. At the end of this indentureship, the servants became free citizens. This is the book, by the way, so I have my outline in the book. I like to follow along both places. So we first have indentured servants, and then it discusses the plantation system. So basically, this system is based on cultivating and exporting crops such as sugar, tobacco, and rice on large traits with a large, cheap labor force. So obviously, everyone's goal is to have cheap labor and then profit off your sales. So that was the whole idea of indentured servants. I went and highlighted some of the quotes that I liked. So this one says, "All servants imported and brought into the country, who were not Christians in their native country, shall be accounted and be slaves. All Negro, mulatto, and Indian slaves with this dominion shall be held to be real estate. If any slave resist his master, correcting such slave, and shall happen to be killed in such correction, the master shall be free of all punishment, as if the accident never happened." Oh my gosh, it's so heartbreaking to me. This chapter was kind of hard to read for me. So then it jumps into the contact situation some more, and get out of there. Okay. Now it's going to talk about what caused slavery. So essentially, what caused slavery was the labor supply problem. The labor supply problem, the colonies sometimes exploited the closest tribes of Native Americans for their power. So basically, they tried out Native Americans first. However, they realized that Native Americans were super familiar to the geometry around them, and they were the geography around that was surrounding them, and so it made it easy for them to escape. That's why that's what began them shipping slaves in. And now it's going to talk about, it's really important, probably the most important part of the whole chapter, if you don't get anything away from this, is the null hypothesis and the Blauner hypothesis. So the null hypothesis identifies 3 features of the contact situation that lead to inequality between groups, any of these groups, African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans. So it dives into ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a tendency to judge other individuals, groups, or societies by your own cultural standards. Obviously, this still exists today. However, I think during these times back then, it was definitely more prevalent. Another factor of the null hypothesis is competition. So competition, it refers to the struggle over scarce resources. So like food and shelter and cropping. These dominant groups serves their own interests by ending the competition and exploiting, controlling, eliminating, or otherwise dominating the minority group. So that's the second point of the null hypothesis. The third is differential in power. Differential in power between the groups during the contact situation. Differential in power has 3 factors: size, organization, resources. So the bigger the group, the more organized the group, the more resources this group has, like the whites took over. And because of all of these factors, competition, ethnocentrism, the null hypothesis supports this reasoning behind how slavery came about. Second most important hypothesis is the Blauner hypothesis. So essentially, Blauner hypothesis has 2 different groups: colonization and immigration. Colonization, think of African Americans. They were colonized and conquered, and therefore they will experience a disadvantaged status longer than groups created by immigration. So groups created by immigration, you think of Native Americans, Mexican Americans, when they brought their resources with them. So obviously the conquered group is going to have a disadvantage. That's the Blauner hypothesis. Then the chapter divulges into the creation of slavery in the United States, and it basically ties all these hypotheses together. And there's a little chart here that, breaks it down, breaks the null hypothesis down, and it's a good point. It's a good point to read, but I just kind of didn't highlight that. What I did highlight next was chattel slavery. So when I hear chattel, I think of cattle, and it's what it really essentially is. Like, these slaves were treated like cattle. They were not humans. They were rather private property instead of human beings, and that's what chattel slavery was. They were private property, and they exchanged them as such. And then slavery was also a closed system. Or a caste system. So here I highlighted paternalism, chattel slavery, and caste system. These are all important terms. And caste system is a closed stratification system in which the social class you were born into is permanent. Next heading talks about pseudo-tolerism. So pseudo means fake. That's how I remember it, fake tolerance. Here it basically says that whites maintained a level of tolerance and towards enslaved people. So whites basically kind of flaunted their slaves. Like, it's fake tolerance. I put an example here. I kind of got it from the book, but I put an example here. Hey, I provided my slaves with shelter and clothing. What did you provide your slaves with, huh? Like, that's how I think of pseudo-tolerance. The next heading, powerless and resistance. This is where it just like strikes me in the heart. It's so sad. Powerless and resistance. This paragraph talks about how the slaves resisted slavery. They did this by running away, open rebellion, learning to read and write, stealing from their owners, destroying property, hurting themselves, or killing their owners or committing suicide. It also talks about the abolitionism and Harriet Tubman. I'm sure we all know who Harriet Tubman is, and she was the best known conductor of the Underground Railroad that ran for about 31 years. She helped more than 300 people. The next is African American culture. So here it just says like these slaves forged their culture. They participated in folklore, music, religion, family, and other things. Not too much going on there. Next we get into the dimensions of minority group status. It's going to talk about power and equality, institutional discrimination, prejudice, and racism. So slavery wasn't created because of prejudice and racism. Like I said earlier, it was created due to the labor supply and making profits. It's all about money. It always has been. It's always about money today. So slavery was not created by prejudice and racism. It says here, I highlighted a few points that I liked. It said white colonists didn't originally enslave black people because of prejudice or dislike of blacks. They did it to solve labor supply problem. However, prejudice and racism were essential to creating blacks' minority group status and to rationalizing and explaining the emergency system of advantage enjoyed by whites. So like I said earlier, this pseudo tolerance created prejudice and racism. I just highlighted the same thing over and over. Next, it goes into assimilation. So where am I at? Oh, right here. So assimilation, this paragraph, basically there have been a bunch of studies on the impact of slavery on Americans. I personally liked this guy. His name was Elkins. I know his name was Elkins. What was his? Stanley Elkins. I like this paragraph. Stanley Elkins asserted that slavery brainwashed and dehumanized enslaved people, stripping them of their heritage and culture. He asserted that slaves sought to please their owners like people in concentration camps sought to appease Nazis. So Stanley Elkins compared slavery to the concentration camps of the, oh my gosh, I'm having a brain fart here, of the Holocaust. I'm so sorry. Some scholars view this argument as overstated at best and highly problematic at worst. Yeah, I'll probably bring up a huge controversy by comparing those two. But I think it is on that end of the spectrum, personally. So after assimilation, we have regional variations and the system of slavery. So it pretty much lists a whole bunch of statistics here, breaking it down by state. And then it mentions, to understand the system of slavery, we can't limit our discussion to slave owners because that obscures how many other people benefited from slavery. So for example, not people who owned slaves, but rather who rented them seasonally or whenever they could, whenever they needed to. Or a lot of white women relied on the black slaves for cleaning and cooking. And although they didn't, personally use them as their own transaction, they still benefited from their work that they produced. So yeah, they're taking advantage of slaves and they're utilizing them. We can't forget about all those people. The next section, gender relations, discusses the gender roles that were existing at the times between white people and black people. the degree of gender inequality in slave communities was less than among whites, since slaves had little autonomy and fewer resources to begin with. African American were at the bottom of the social system, so obviously it went white men, white women, black men, white black women, and they were at the bottom of the totem pole. And due to their vulnerability and their powerlessness, a lot of Black enslaved women were at risk for sexual victimization by white men because, they had no choice. The next section, Gender in Daily Life, talks about the daily life that both parties experienced. Women in the kitchen, I put women in the kitchen for long hours and men in the field for long but few hours. So if you think about it, women got up during the day, they started cooking, they were in the house cleaning during the time that the men were out in the field. And by the time the men went to sleep, had dinner and went to sleep, the Black slaves were still up cleaning. So the women worked longer hours than men back in the day. The next section, the creation of minority status for Native Americans and Mexican Americans. Here, it basically breaks down each of the groups. So it starts with Native Americans. It first points out that there's no such thing as an American Indian, rather than there's several hundred tribes that existed. However, those tribes quickly diminished in size due to colonization and taking it over and conquering them. And diseases spread quickly throughout the Native Americans, and food supply eventually diminished. And then it talks about gender relations within the Native Americans. And it was actually not unusual for women in many tribes to play key roles, such as in politics, warfare, and the economy. And then it discusses it incorporates the two hypotheses that we discussed earlier into the Native American group. Next, the chapter talks about Mexican Americans. So Mexican Americans, we're going to cover Texas, California, and Arizona, and Mexico. So Texas was the first state to experience the effects of the expansion. It goes on to say that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico was defeated, and due to the treaties, the Mexicans became the minority group. California, gold rush, laws were passed, and even more laws were passed, and then that's how the Anglo-Americans became the dominant group. Finally, Arizona and Mexico, they had, in other words, the contact situation for Mexican Americans was varied by region. So some areas were more rapidly affected than others, and like the other states, the result was the minority group for Mexican Americans was created. Here it then incorporates the null hypothesis and Bonner hypotheses. And then it divulges into gender relations between these minority groups, and then the chapter goes on to compare minority groups. I'm not saying it's not important, this section. However, I think the most important part to focus on in this chapter is the beginning, all these key terms. Go over it if you have time, and thank you for watching. Sorry for the poor video quality.